Welcome to Mr. Nightmare. I am the investigator who opens the files you shouldn't see. The story I bring you tonight begins not with a crime, but with the chilling scent of surrender. I was there, and the first thing I smelled wasn't death. It was the sickeningly sweet scent of Kool-Aid mixed with bitter almond. The air that hit me when I stepped off the small plane in Guyana on November 19, 1978, was thick, oppressive, and heavy with jungle heat. I was part of the first American team to reach the settlement, days after the massacre. As I pushed through the vegetation into the main compound, the initial shock wasn't the number of bodies, it was the smell. It was a pervasive synthetic sweetness of fruit drink, layered with the sharp metallic tang of cyanide. I immediately knew I had walked into a silent apocalypse, not a chaotic massacre. The sight that confronted me defied human comprehension. Bodies were everywhere, hundreds of them, lying closely together in rows near the central pavilion. I saw children first, small bodies resting beneath their mothers, followed by entire families in neat lines. There was no chaos, no sign of a desperate final struggle, no overturned tables or broken furniture. They had died in a devastating organized surrender. The terrifying question immediately formed in my mind. How does a single man command over 900 people, including entire families, to consume poison without massive, audible rebellion? The utter lack of resistance was the most damning testimony against Jim Jones. The people had followed the first rule of the cult to the very end. I searched the scene, looking for signs of a fight, for anything that indicated the will to survive, but found only evidence of compliance. The psychological crisis of the scene was this chilling order. My eyes were drawn to the large metal vat near the pavilion. It stood as the undeniable physical evidence of the final lethal instruction. The vat was empty, but the sticky, sweet residue of the poison mixture was still visible inside its walls. Nearby, the discarded packets that had once contained the deadly chemicals lay scattered, silent artifacts of the final command. I remember staring at the vat, trying to reconcile the image of a simple communal drink with the mass of bodies surrounding it. It was the ultimate cold-blooded communion. The silence of the dead was the only rule that mattered, and Jim Jones had meticulously enforced it. This scene was not random. It was the inevitable, tragic conclusion of absolute, unchecked control. The Promised Land was not paradise. It was a psychological prison built on the currency of absolute belief and isolation. To truly grasp the magnitude of the horror I saw, I had to move past the bodies and understand the story of the living, the history of the People's Temple. I had to ask, how did 918 people come to believe that obedience to one man was the key to salvation? The answer lies not in Guyana, but in the idealistic facade Jim Jones built in the United States. His initial message was one of powerful appeal: racial integration, social justice, and a communal utopia that promised safety from the racism and economic inequality of 1960s America. People followed him because his message was one of genuine hope. They were seeking a better world, a community where everyone was truly equal. They sold their possessions, signed over their life savings, and committed their futures to the charismatic power of Jim Jones. This absolute commitment, this willingness to abandon their past lives for a shared future, was their fundamental vulnerability. They sacrificed individual identity for communal security. As the movement grew, the utopian facade began to crack, replaced by paranoia and increased totalitarian control. Jones, facing mounting scrutiny from journalists and defectors in California, made the ultimate calculated decision: retreat. He convinced his followers that the United States was collapsing and that their only salvation lay in migrating to a secluded, distant haven. That haven was Jonestown, a settlement carved out of the dense, oppressive jungle of Guyana. This physical move was the first critical step in establishing absolute control. Jonestown was geographically isolated. It was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by plane or riverboat, requiring immense effort and cost to reach. This remote location was not chosen for its natural beauty. It was chosen for its strategic advantage in ensuring absolute physical isolation. Once members arrived, they could not easily leave. The dense, unforgiving jungle was a far more effective wall than any barbed wire fence, transforming the Promised Land into a self-imposed prison. The vulnerability was immediately leveraged upon arrival. Jones systematically stripped his followers of their individuality and their ties to the outside world. All passports and personal funds were collected by the community. A crucial piece of evidence I would later find. Part 6, Foreshadowing. Communication with the outside world was heavily restricted, and all incoming and outgoing mail was censored. The community was constantly under surveillance, fostering an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion. The workday was brutal, often lasting 10 to 12 hours under the oppressive equatorial heat, followed by mandatory communal meetings that stretched late into the night. This strategic sleep deprivation and continuous communal activity were carefully engineered to break down the ability for individual critical thought, a tactic of psychological manipulation that Jones perfected. Jones enforced obedience through fear and public humiliation. Any deviation from the communal rule, any expression of doubt was punished severely with physical labor, public beatings, or being confined to the disciplinary box. The message was clear. The collective was all that mattered, and Father, Jones's self-proclaimed title, was the sole source of truth and survival. This environment meant that the psychological barrier to leaving was higher than the physical barrier of the jungle. Members stayed not because the utopia was successful, but because they were convinced that outside the walls of Jonestown, only chaos and the persecution awaited them. They were emotionally, physically, and financially trapped. The absolute commitment to the utopian ideal, forged in America, was violently repurposed in Guyana into a complete, unquestioning obedience to one deeply disturbed man. The foundations of the devastating surrender I witnessed were laid over years, brick by terrifying brick, built on the currency of absolute belief. The greatest threat to a god is the presence of an outsider asking questions. For years, Jim Jones had successfully built his isolated empire, convincing his followers that the outside world was chaotic, corrupt, and obsessed with destroying them. Part 2. He enforced obedience through fear, but that fear was always abstract, until the arrival of Congressman Leo Ryan. The presence of an elected official from the United States government, accompanied by a delegation of concerned relatives and international journalists, was the ultimate direct challenge to Jones's absolute authority. This was the terrifying omen that signaled the end of Jonestown's quiet experiment. I had tracked the history of Jim Jones long enough to know that he could tolerate scrutiny from local reporters, but a challenge from Washington, a challenge to his sovereign power, would lead to an immediate violent reaction. Ryan's visit was intended to be an investigation into claims of abuse, forced labor, and members being held against their will, claims that had slowly filtered back to the United States from terrified defectors. The atmosphere upon the delegation's arrival was immediately charged with tension. Jones greeted them with a staged display of welcome, orchestrated to show a happy, productive, integrated community. But beneath the smiles of the members, fear was palpable. Ryan's delegation spent 2 tense days interviewing members. Jones tried every tactic to maintain his facade of control, constantly shadowing the congressman, ensuring the most devoted members spoke to the press, and orchestrating a final, festive dinner to celebrate their success. Yet, despite the pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and intimidation, the truth began to emerge. A few members, those whose wills had not been entirely broken by years of psychological conditioning, quietly risked everything. They passed urgent, whispered messages to the delegation, desperately slipping notes into Ryan's hands, begging to be taken out of Jonestown immediately. I realized that the true number of people who wanted to escape was likely far higher than anyone had estimated. But the systemic fear, Part 2, kept them silent. The situation turned irrevocably chaotic on the afternoon of November 18, 1978. As the delegation prepared to leave, a small group of members, around 16 people, including families and a few elderly individuals, made a break for freedom, pleading with Ryan to take them back to the United States. This public defection was the final, devastating blow to Jim Jones's self-image and his control. The utopia was crumbling before the eyes of the press, and the exposure would guarantee the end of his cult. Jones could not allow these defectors to leave and testify against him. His immediate response was not spiritual. It was political and utterly violent. As the defectors were being escorted to the small aircraft waiting at the remote Port Kaituma airstrip, the violence erupted. a truck full of Jones's armed security guards arrived. The air was split by the sound of gunfire, transforming the remote runway into a horrific ambush. The assassins systematically opened fire on the departing delegation and the defectors. I would later piece together the terrifying facts. Congressman Ryan was killed instantly, struck multiple times as he tried to protect a defector. 3 journalists were also killed, ensuring that the final critical footage of the compound's collapse would never fully be recorded. The attack was swift, brutal, and strategically executed to eliminate the most dangerous threats, the representative of the U.S. government, and the media who would report the truth. This attack on the tarmac was the Omen, the terrifying confirmation that Jones had crossed the line into undeniable mass violence. He had murdered a U.S. congressman and journalists on foreign soil. Jones knew the U.S. government would now respond, likely with military or armed police force. His illusion of sovereignty was shattered, and the external world was coming for him. The attack on the airstrip guaranteed one terrible final outcome. The experiment of Jonestown was over, and the only remaining decision for Jones was how and when the final surrender would take place. After the shooting on the tarmac, the question instantly shifted from "What is Jim Jones doing?" to the far more devastating question, "Why are those 900 people still inside the compound?" I tracked the public reaction as news of the congressman's assassination reached the United States, and the dominant response from officials and the media was immediate, profound disbelief. They struggled to rationalize the impossible loyalty demonstrated by the remaining members inside Jonestown. This entire phase of the case was defined by society's failure to understand the depth of cult psychology. The external world, including the U.S. State Department, tried desperately to apply conventional logic to an entirely unconventional situation. They viewed Jones's followers not as victims of extreme psychological warfare, but as educated American citizens who should have retained their free will. It was easier for them to rationalize the situation by believing the members were simply a fringe religious group, perhaps eccentric, but ultimately harmless. This refusal to accept the reality of the mind control was the institutional error that cost hundreds of lives. They rationalized Jones's previous threats and volatile behavior as mere theatrics, ignoring the consistent reports of abuse and forced detention that had filtered back for years. I had to put myself in the position of the members to truly understand their compliance. For the people inside Jonestown, obedience was not just an act of faith, it was a matter of survival. They had been systematically stripped of all conventional ties to the outside world. Their money, their passports, and their personal identity were gone. Part 2. They were convinced by Jones that the outside world was actively conspiring to destroy them. He constantly fed them propaganda about impending persecution, a coming race war, and the U.S. government's obsessive plot to dismantle their integrated society. Inside the isolated walls of Jonestown, choosing to obey Jones, to stay within the perceived safety of the collective, was, terrifyingly, the only rational choice left to them. They rationalized the endless labor, the public humiliations, and the brutal punishments as necessary trials for the greater good, the essential sacrifices required to maintain their fragile utopia. The reality of the compound itself provided constant, brutal reinforcement of this obedience. I knew Jones relied on physical tactics to break individual will. The continuous mandatory communal meetings, often stretching from early evening until deep into the night, ensured chronic sleep deprivation. This physical exhaustion made critical thinking almost impossible, leaving members psychologically vulnerable to Jones's constant manipulative sermons. Furthermore, Jones perfected the cult technique of love bombing, overwhelming new members with affection and communal acceptance, only to withdraw that acceptance through public humiliation or punishment if they showed dissent. This created an environment where the members desperately clung to Jones's approval as their sole measure of self-worth. They rationalized the abuse because the alternative was expulsion into the hostile jungle, or worse, the perceived chaos of the outside world. The ultimate failure of the U.S. government was their inability to move past their own bureaucratic inertia and political rationalization. Despite the undeniable evidence of the airport shooting, Part 3, the critical hours immediately following the ambush were lost in a terrifying vortex of diplomatic delays, jurisdictional arguments, and internal debate over whether a U.S. military presence was necessary on foreign soil. They were trying to apply the slow, measured logic of Washington to a situation that demanded immediate, overwhelming force. They failed to realize that the delay was not just measured in hours, it was measured in lives. They tried to rationalize Jones as a crazy leader who would eventually surrender, ignoring the history of the White Knight drills, Part 7 foreshadowing, that proved his commitment to revolutionary suicide was absolute. The system failed to see the truth, that the faith of Jones's followers was so meticulously engineered that, when confronted by the threat of exposure, only absolute annihilation remained the rational choice for the cult. The outside world spent critical hours paralyzed by disbelief and bureaucratic delay, trying to rationalize the impossible obedience. Part 4. But the killer, in his final manic act of control, had left us a complete confession, a first-hand record of the execution. I was part of the investigative team that retrieved the audio cassette, labeled Q042, found near Jim Jones's body. This 44-minute recording, now infamously known as the death tape, was the most crucial, definitive piece of evidence recovered. It was the killer's final, direct dialogue with his followers, a horrifying script that chronicled the very moments leading up to the mass suicide. When I first listened to the tape, the immediate atmosphere was unnerving. The quality was poor, filled with static and background noise, yet Jones's voice cut through it all, deep, urgent, and manic. The tape captured the entire final meeting, held immediately after the news of Congressman Ryan's assassination, Part 3, reached the compound. Jones knew the outside world was coming, and he knew his experiment was over. His voice was the central actor, forcing compliance through sheer psychological dominance. He preached with relentless desperation, weaving a terrifying narrative of imminent doom. The United States government would immediately retaliate, military forces would invade Jonestown, and their children would be taken, tortured, and murdered. The core of Jones's manipulative rhetoric was the demand for revolutionary suicide. He told his followers that they could not allow themselves to fall into the hands of the enemy. They had to die with dignity, making a statement against fascism and racism. This carefully constructed lie, that mass murder was an act of political protest and spiritual purity, was the final defense that broke the members' will. The tape documented the victims' chilling response. As Jones laid out the plan, you could hear the voices of the most loyal members affirming his decision, shouting, "Yes, yes," over the sounds of rising panic. Their psychological conditioning, the years of sleep deprivation, fear, and absolute isolation, Part 2, had created a powerful echo chamber where obedience became the only rational choice. But the tape was more than just Jones's dialogue. It captured the terrifying descent and the chilling final logistics. We could clearly hear the desperate, courageous voices of a few members who resisted, pleading for life and for the safety of the children. These voices of sanity were immediately drowned out, both by the loyalists chanting and by Jones's own amplified fury. He systematically dismissed their pleas, mocking their weakness and condemning them as traitors to the collective. This conflict was the final, heartbreaking battle for the members' souls, and it was lost in real time. The sounds documented the meticulous process, the audible instructions to bring forward the vat, the sound of the contents being mixed, the sickeningly sweet blend of cyanide, tranquilizers, and flavoring agents. The most disturbing part of the recording was the final, muffled sounds, the crying of the babies and children, followed by the chilling rhythmic noise of the adults and medical team, following Jones's final instruction, forcing the poison into the unwilling members. The tape provided the definitive answer to the impossible question I had upon arriving at the scene. Part 1. How did the compliance occur? The tape proved that the mass death was not a passive surrender. It was a loud, intense, verbally enforced execution, disguised as a ritual. The ultimate revelation was that the chaos of the outside world was met with an even greater, more terrifying chaos inside the mind of the man who held the microphone. The tape was the ultimate act of narcissistic control, a voice determined to record its final destructive statement for history, ensuring the outside world would never doubt his power. I knew that the psychological compliance was profound, but the true agony lay in the realization that physically, they could have walked away. My team and I spent days meticulously processing the Jonestown compound, After the immediate shock of the bodies subsided, we focused on the structures, searching for any scrap of evidence that could explain the utter lack of resistance. We were looking for a sign of a physical fight, a hidden radio, anything that suggested an attempt to flee. But what we found was far more chilling than a struggle. We found the meticulous, almost bureaucratic evidence of their complete surrender to Jim. Jones's psychological rule, the greatest physical contradiction I found was in the administrative building, the unused passports and the collected money. In a locked filing cabinet, untouched by the final chaotic hours, lay hundreds of U.S. passports and stacks of personal cash, signed over by the members. These were the only keys to freedom. Each passport was a physical ticket out of the remote jungle, a document recognized by every border guard and every international authority. These people were American citizens. They had a right to leave, and they possessed the literal means, their money and identity papers, to fund that escape. Yet there they were, neatly filed away, useless. The presence of the passports confirmed a fact I already suspected. This was not a desperate group trapped by geography alone. They were trapped by a system. Jones had systematically demanded that upon arrival, Part 2, all personal funds and identification be surrendered to the communal treasury. This act, rationalized to the members as a commitment to the collective ideal and protection from the corrupt outside world, was in reality the critical step in stripping their autonomy. Jones ensured that even if a member managed to overcome the deep psychological barriers and decided to leave, they had no means to do so. Without a passport, without money, they were simply illegal aliens in a foreign country, instantly deterred by the unforgiving jungle outside the compound walls. This contradiction, the physical proximity of freedom juxtaposed with the absolute inability to grasp, it was a haunting piece of visual evidence. I held some of those passports in my hands, looking at the faded photographs of ordinary American families, seeing their original optimism reflected in the glossy paper. I knew that at any point, a powerful individual or a small group could have seized those files, distributed the passports, and staged a rebellion or a mass escape. That they did not or could not reinforce the powerful grip of the psychological chains Jones had implemented. The unused passports were physical proof that the psychological walls were far stronger than the lock on any cabinet door. The money and the documents represented their final, collective decision to subordinate the value of their individual lives to the perceived security of the cult. Furthermore, the collected funds provided chilling insight into the cult's finances. The vast amount of money found confirmed the suspicion that Jones had successfully amassed an enormous personal fortune through the systemic coercion of his followers, many of whom had liquidated their life savings for the communal dream. This massive concentration of wealth in the hands of Jones was the ultimate motive behind the extreme isolation. Jonestown was not just a commune. It was a highly lucrative financial enterprise that Jones was determined to protect from outside scrutiny. The unused assets testified to the financial trap that underpinned the entire structure of the so-called utopian society. The files also contained extensive, detailed records of individual members, biographical data, psychological assessments, and even handwritten notes detailing their level of commitment and susceptibility to punishment. Jones maintained these meticulous records not for community welfare, but for total control and manipulation. He used this information to expose secrets during public meetings, ensuring no one felt they truly possessed privacy or secrets that Jones did not already know. These files, found next to the passports, represented the complete inventory of the cult members' lives, confirming that Jones possessed every single piece of information, personal, financial, and legal, that allowed him to maintain his unchallengeable authority right up until the last moments. The unused passports were a stark, cold testament to the psychological rule that once you drink the water of Jonestown, your life, your identity, and your right to leave no longer belong to you. The systematic collection of passports and assets, Part 6, explained why they could not physically escape. But after seeing the bodies, the quiet, overwhelming compliance, I still faced the terrifying psychological question. How do you make 900 people execute themselves simultaneously? The answer, I found through reviewing defector testimonies and internal documents, was that the final moments were not a spontaneous decision, They were a performance that had been meticulously rehearsed over years. This evidence, collectively known as the White Night Drills, was the chilling turning point that proved the tragedy was premeditated. These White Night Drills were systematic, psychological conditioning sessions, held repeatedly throughout the final years of the cult. They were organized often, sometimes monthly, sometimes weekly, and always designed to maximize psychological distress. Jim Jones understood that to control lives, he must first control the fear of death. The sessions were held abruptly, often late at night, after mandatory communal meetings had already stretched deep into the dark, utilizing the state of chronic sleep deprivation, part 2, that kept the members mentally vulnerable. The alarm bells would sound, and every single person, from the children to the elderly, was required to rush to the central pavilion. Jones or his most trusted aides would announce a dire, immediate threat, a raid by enemies, an attack by the CIA, or a final crisis that demanded their ultimate sacrifice. The setup was simple but devastatingly effective. They were given a beverage, often Kool-Aid or Flavor Aid, which Jones would dramatically declare was poisoned. He would announce with messianic fervor, "This is the moment for revolutionary suicide. Drink and we will die together in dignity before the enemy can take us." The test was immediate, terrifying, and absolute. The members were required to drink the liquid, which during the drills was only flavored water, not poison. The point was not the death itself, but the willingness to accept the final command. I studied the transcripts and heard the desperation in the voices of those few who resisted, those who faltered or expressed panic. These moments of dissent were immediately targeted by Jones. He used the drills as loyalty tests, isolating any individual who hesitated and subjecting them to immediate, brutal public humiliation. The individual was forced to rationalize their own fear of dying as betrayal of the collective ideal. By manipulating the us versus them mentality, Jones successfully inverted the basic human instinct for survival. He programmed them to believe that their own survival was selfish and that death, if ordered by Father, was the only path to purity and honor. This repetition was the genius of the psychological manipulation. By forcing his followers to confront and accept death multiple times, Jones successfully normalized the idea of suicide. He systematically desensitized them to the very act that should have triggered a mass revolt. When the members drank the non-poisonous liquid, they were practicing compliance. The drill would end with Jones praising their loyalty but adding the chilling finality. "Next time, it will be real, and anyone who wavers will be condemned." The drills ensured that the members crossed the psychological line years before the actual event. When the news of Congressman Ryan's assassination arrived, Part 3, Jim Jones used the absolute authority gained from these drills. He called the final meeting, and for the vast majority of the members, they were conditioned to react instantly. The sound of his voice demanding revolutionary suicide was not a new order. It was the final expected cue in a script they had been practicing for years. They had been trained to react with obedience, not rebellion. The White Night Drills are the clearest, most undeniable evidence that the final tragedy was not a spontaneous act of shared madness, but a meticulous, horrifying act of premeditated psychological warfare. The cult was ready to die. The world was simply not ready to believe them. The institutional crisis that consumed the final hours of Jonestown was a failure of imagination, a tragic, fatal inability of the outside world to comprehend the absolute psychological reality of what Jim Jones had built. The shooting of Congressman Leo Ryan on the tarmac, Part 3, was the undeniable signal of lethal intent. Yet the crucial immediate response from the U.S. government was not mobilization, but paralysis. I tracked the agonizing timeline following that ambush, and I can tell you that the most horrifying part of the case is the realization that the official systems designed to protect American citizens failed entirely, paralyzed by bureaucracy and a disbelief that bordered on denial. The immediate hours following the assassination, the crucial window, when the 900 lives remaining in the compound might have been saved, were lost in a fog of jurisdictional arguments and political rationalization. U.S. State Department officials and diplomats were quick to condemn the murder of a sitting congressman, but agonizingly slow to grasp the true immediate threat to the hundreds of members remaining in the remote Guyanese jungle. They viewed Jonestown as a complex political and diplomatic nightmare, not as an active, imminent mass murder scene. They argued over protocol, over whether sending U.S. forces onto foreign soil was legally permissible, and debated the logistics and cost of sending rescue teams. The initial reports focused heavily on retaliation for Ryan, utterly failing to prioritize the rescue of the followers. This delay was the price of disbelief. The institutional mindset struggled to accept that the charismatic American figure known as Jim Jones would willingly command the deaths of nearly 1,000 of his own followers. They rationalized that Jones, faced with imminent exposure and the consequences of his crime, would eventually surrender, or that the Guyanese government would intervene. This misplaced faith in Jones's rational self-interest and in the capability of a foreign, under-equipped local authority cost every subsequent life. I listened to the transcripts and reports detailing the mounting urgency from the few surviving delegation members and concerned relatives who were screaming at officials in Georgetown and Washington, pleading with them to understand that the final act was not a threat but a guarantee. Their desperate warnings were met with procedural roadblocks and reassurances that Jones was under observation. The official delay allowed Jones to operate with complete immunity in those final, terrible hours. He knew the world was coming, but he also knew the speed of their response would be glacial. He had the time necessary to gather every member, articulate his final delusional demands, Part 5, and enforce the final irreversible command. The systemic inability to move past the rationalization that it couldn't happen here or it couldn't happen like this left the entire community exposed. The few officials who argued for immediate armed intervention were constantly overruled by bureaucratic caution. The government, focused on avoiding an international incident, failed to see that the incident was already underway, orchestrated by a man who had already committed to revolutionary suicide. The devastating silence that eventually fell over Jonestown was the final, terrifying symptom of this institutional failure. When the first Guyanese Defense Forces finally reached the compound, hours after the systematic execution had begun, they were met not with resistance or chaos, but with the quiet of the mass grave. The ultimate tragedy was that the American system had been given clear, actionable warning, the shooting of Congressman Ryan, and possessed the resources to intervene, but was paralyzed by its own rigid protocol and its fatal inability to believe in the depth of Jones's madness. The failure of those agonizing, wasted hours stands as the highest price ever paid for political and institutional disbelief. The agonizing institutional failure in the hours following the shooting, Part 8, left 900 people condemned, forcing those of us who arrived afterward to seek the truth not in diplomatic cables, but in the psychological wreckage of the compound. The world believed Jim Jones was a devil, a figure of pure transcendent evil. I found he was simply a broken, paranoid man whose mental illness was chemically amplified, and that was the ultimate terrifying revelation. The final moments recorded on the death tape, Part 5, captured a voice demanding absolute sacrifice. But the deeper truth, the final crucial piece of evidence, was found in the medical files. Jones was not a spiritual prophet. He was a desperate addict and a severely ill man. Jones's body was recovered with high concentrations of phenobarbital, a powerful sedative, and other prescription drugs in his system. This confirmed what defectors had long claimed. For years, Jones had maintained a crippling dependence on various pharmaceuticals, often mixing sedatives to sleep with amphetamines to stay awake for his mandatory, all-night sermons. This drug regimen, while attempting to regulate his increasingly erratic moods and control his schedule, simultaneously fueled and amplified his pre-existing messianic complex and paranoia. His medical state was the factual source of his final, terrifying descent. The constant flow of powerful chemicals through his system created an environment of narcotic-induced psychosis. This is the key truth I discovered. The prophecies and declarations of imminent persecution that drove the final massacre were often the product of his chemical imbalance, not genuine spiritual insight. As his mental state deteriorated, the threats he preached about, the CIA closing in, the impending race war, the destruction of Jonestown, became frighteningly real to him. His paranoia was not a performance. It was a devastating medical condition that his followers, isolated and psychologically broken, were forced to accept as divine truth. The final sermon was therefore not a spiritual guide. It was the documented rant of a man losing his grasp on reality. I analyzed the transcripts of his earlier sermons and compared them to the final death tape. The early Jones was manipulative, but coherent, focused on ideological and social change. The final Jones was unhinged, his voice laced with irrationality and desperation, obsessed only with control and the final theatrical act of destruction. His physical pain, stemming from real medical issues, became integrated into his sermons, demanding his followers suffer as he suffered. He made suffering and sacrifice a mandatory rule, ensuring that their shared experience of hardship reinforced their absolute dependency on him for salvation. This psychological tyranny was the ultimate manipulation, turning his personal pain into a collective mandate for death. The profound tragedy of this revelation lies in the failure of his followers to recognize the source of the breakdown. They were so thoroughly conditioned by the White Knight drills, Part 7, and the Isolation, Part 2, that they accepted his drug-fueled paranoia as the ultimate necessary truth. When he commanded the poison, they obeyed not a divine figure, but the voice of a broken, toxic man whose mental state had collapsed entirely. The final sermon was the ultimate human tragedy, proving that the most devastating horror is not external, but the complete, unchecked psychological power wielded by a single, desperately ill individual. The revelation of Jones's drug abuse and profound mental decline is the final, essential key to understanding that Jonestown was not a spiritual event. It was a public execution driven by a chemical and psychological breakdown. The systematic failure of the outside world to intervene, Part 8, and the manic paranoid sermon of Jim Jones, Part 9, had set the stage for the final, devastating surrender. But amidst the hundreds of bodies I saw on the ground, I knew there was a counter-narrative, a story of profound, desperate resistance. The sound of Jones's voice commanded death, but the terrifying silence of the surrounding jungle offered a small, chaotic chance at life. This final, critical phase of the Jonestown tragedy was defined by the few individuals who actively defied the final, fatal command. Their actions proved that the will to survive, though deeply buried by years of conditioning and fear, was not entirely extinguished. This is the story of the last escape, the final, desperate act of survival that complicates Jones's narrative of total control. The resistance began not in the final moments, but hours earlier. The initial group of defectors who pleaded with Congressman Ryan, Part 3, were the first to break free, their escape tragically punctuated by the ambush on the tarmac. They were the earliest physical evidence that the psychological cage had cracks. Their desperate scramble for the airplane was an active, physical rejection of the cult's primary rule, and their survival, though marked by profound trauma and loss, became the initial factual complication to Jones's illusion of absolute dominion. Their successful frantic flight was the final warning the world ignored, but the final escape, the resistance that occurred while the poison was being mixed, was far more intimate and perilous. As the enormous metal vat was brought forward and the final order was issued, a few brave, fragmented groups recognized the gravity of the situation and chose to run. I later heard the testimonies of those who survived, the teenagers who ran into the dense, black tangle of the jungle, navigating without lights or water, moving solely on instinct and the sheer overwhelming terror of the scene they left behind. They were running not toward civilization, but away from absolute death, choosing the unpredictable perils of the South American wilderness over the guaranteed finality of the poisoned Kool-Aid. Their survival was a testament to physical endurance and the sudden overwhelming priority of the will to live. The internal resistance was equally profound. Even within the central pavilion, facing the intense pressure of Jones's voice and the hostile stares of the armed security guards, not everyone immediately submitted. I later learned of individuals who argued against the suicide, who actively struggled or who tried to smuggle children out of the gathering. These acts of defiance were quickly, brutally silenced by the most fanatical members in the security team. The very presence of those strong members who refused to drink, who had to be held down or forcibly injected with the poison, is the internal proof that the compliance was never unanimous. It complicates the quiet surrender I witnessed, Part 1. The knowledge that some people fought back, even when facing a gun or the condemnation of their entire community, provides the final, essential human element to the otherwise inhuman narrative. The terrifying burden carried by the survivors is the final chapter of their escape. They carried with them the indelible knowledge of what they left behind, the friends, the family, the children they could not save. Their lives became the final, living piece of evidence against Jones's power. Their survival proved that even in an environment engineered for total psychological subjugation, Part 7, the inherent, messy human will to survive could not be entirely programmed out. Their act of survival was the only thing that truly tarnished Jones's carefully orchestrated image of a complete, unified death statement. The stories of the few who found the last escape, Part 10, confirmed the human will to survive. But the greatest horror of Jonestown wasn't the cyanide. It was the chilling clinical efficiency of the mind control that defeated the vast majority. The true legacy of Jonestown is a permanent, terrifying case study in the anatomy of absolute control. As an investigator, my focus shifted from counting the dead to dissecting the psychological system that created them. To understand how Jones manufactured such unwavering obedience, I realized the profound truth. Jim Jones did not rely on spiritual power. He relied on scientific methods of psychological warfare. I analyzed the testimonies of survivors and internal documents, piecing together the system of control. It was procedural and ruthless, designed to systematically dismantle individual identity and replace it with total dependency on Father. This control was enforced through 4 primary, factual techniques. First, physical and geographic isolation. Jones engineered a remote location where the physical barrier, the jungle, reinforced the psychological barrier. By forcing members to surrender their passports and money, Part 6, he stripped away their ability to leave and their ability to contact the outside world. This isolation ensured that Jones's voice and Jones's version of reality were the only ones that mattered. Outside the compound there was no hope. Inside there was only Jones. Second, systematic sleep deprivation and exhaustion. The long working hours under the equatorial heat, immediately followed by mandatory all-night communal meetings, were not designed for community building. They were designed to exhaust the mind, making critical thinking impossible, and leaving members psychologically susceptible to Jones's erratic, loud sermons. Part 5. The chronic lack of sleep erased their ability to question, rendering their minds pliable and obedient. Third, economic and social deprivation. Jones seized all communal assets, forcing members into a state of total financial dependency on the temple. Furthermore, he systematically discouraged and punished intimate, personal relationships, ensuring that the only emotional fulfillment and social connection members received came directly through their devotion to Jones and the collective. This ensured that no one had a strong, independent emotional anchor that could challenge the authority of the cult. Finally, the cycle of love bombing and devaluation. Jones perfected the use of positive and negative reinforcement. New members were overwhelmed with acceptance and communal affection, love bombing. However, any sign of dissent or doubt was met with immediate savage public humiliation, physical punishment, and isolation. This created an environment where members desperately clung to Jones's approval as their sole measure of self-worth. They rationalized the abuse because the alternative was the complete loss of self and banishment into the darkness. The legacy of Jonestown is not about a specific religious belief. It is about the terrifying vulnerability of the human will under systematic duress. Jones's methods were not unique. They were merely an extreme, final demonstration of techniques used by abusive leaders throughout history. The scale of the tragedy forced sociologists and law enforcement agencies to finally recognize and study the true danger of totalist cults. Jonestown became the ultimate definitive case study showing that belief can be engineered, and that the physical execution of hundreds of people can be achieved through the prior, complete execution of their minds. The physical compound has long since been reclaimed by the jungle, but the psychological rules of control that Jim Jones perfected remain actively in use by toxic organizations around the world. The files are now closed. The compound has been reclaimed by the relentless Guyanese jungle, and the world has tried to categorize the sheer terror of November 1978. But for me, the investigator who walked through the devastating silence of that mass grave, the horror of Jonestown is reduced to a single, cold, ultimate truth. The first rule is to obey. This verdict is not sensational. It is the necessary factual conclusion drawn from the analysis of years of psychological warfare, Part 11. The entire structure of the People's Temple, the utopia, the isolation, the financial coercion was simply a terrifyingly efficient mechanism designed to enforce that one fundamental law. The greatest lesson I took from this tragedy is that the 918 deaths were not the result of a sudden shared hysteria. They were the consequence of a meticulous, step-by-step destruction of individual will. Jones's success was absolute because he systematically dismantled every psychological pillar that supports free choice. Part 7. He severed financial and familial ties, leaving no safety net outside the compound. He enforced exhaustion and utilized fear and public humiliation as mandatory tools of discipline. When the final command was issued, the victims had nowhere to run. Part 10, and no capacity left to question. For the people of Jonestown, choosing to obey Father's voice, Part 5, was not an act of faith. It was the final, tragic, and logical endpoint of a life engineered for total subservience. I witnessed the physical evidence of this terrible obedience. Part 1. The stillness, the lack of defensive wounds, the fact that entire families submitted to the fatal drink, it all testifies to the power of the absolute command. Jones did not need a gun to shoot every person. He needed only the unwavering psychological infrastructure he had built. He convinced his followers that the outside world was the enemy, that the only dignity lay in revolutionary suicide, and that their individual lives were forfeit to the purity of the collective. The final terrible act of ingesting the poisoned drink became the ultimate, horrifying confirmation of their complete psychological surrender. The legacy of Jonestown is not simply the death toll. It is the chilling, enduring warning about the terrifying fragility of the human mind under systematic duress. It proves that free will is not an inherent right that cannot be taken. It is a learned skill that can be systematically stripped away by an authority figure who operates without conscience. The first rule is to obey remains the most profound, most dangerous lesson learned from that clearing in the jungle. The system failed to intervene, Part 8, and the price of that institutional disbelief was paid by the families who traded their individual freedom for the deadly illusion of absolute security. The final verdict is not one of spiritual judgment, but a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences when one person's unchecked, paranoid madness is met with the silent, total obedience of nearly 1,000 others. The evidence I reviewed and the stories I heard lead to only one conclusion. The true horror of Jonestown is not a ghost story. It is the true story of psychological tyranny. The final image is that of the metal vat, containing the ultimate fatal instruction. I challenge you. Where was the final moment when the average member could have broken the cycle? Was it the moment they handed over their passports, or the final second before they touched the poison to their lips? Let me know your thoughts on the most chilling rule of all in the comments below. If you dare to delve deeper into the systemic power and psychological manipulation of totalist cults, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The lesson of Jonestown must never be forgotten.